Hey everyone, Josh here. So today we've got a fairly poorly filmed video, but I think the information in the video is going to be handy to have, or somebody's probably going to run into the same issue. So I thought I would do this anyways. Backstory on this car. So she would drive down the road and all of a sudden check engine light and glow plug light would come on. Sometimes it would just flick on, flick off, and then away she would go. Sometimes she'd have to pull over, cycle a key, and then it would start and carry on. So what I think was happening was it was 6-speed manual. So I think the car was actually shutting off and then bump starting itself again, and away it went. So as far as codes outside of the cracked DPF codes that a lot of CJAAs have, it had a P0321, which is engine speed sensor, and a P0088, I think, which was rail pressure too high. So I'm not sure. What I think was happening was we had a wiring issue with the crank sensor, which was killing the car, and bump starting it, or maybe engine was still turning and it wasn't expecting it, and maybe the rail pressure was jumping up. Not 100% sure on the rail pressure one, but the issue that I was there to fix was the check engine light coming on intermittently and it haven't yet restarted. So P0321's engine speed sensor, the car won't run or start if that is active, so it was very intermittent. Her father couldn't get it to act up, but she had it happen a few times, so we were a little fuzzy on exactly what was happening, but this is what I was kind of thinking was happening. So I brought a crank sensor with me, and I was thinking that I was going to find wiring issue, because when I did my wife's CJAA, the whole rebuild video last year, there was a few spots in the wiring harness down around the engine oil filter that isn't in really nice spots, and then you've got the vibration of the diesels, so ended up being a wiring issue. I had a crank sensor with me, but it doesn't look like it's much fun. The oil filter housing has to come off. Fairly certain it has to come off to be able to get it out of there. So it's just I didn't do it. It was at the customers. I had other issues I had to fix as well, so it was a bit of a time crunch, so that was why the videoing was a little poor, and that's why I didn't do the crank sensor. So let's jump into video here. So I had already started removing stuff in plans of doing the crank sensor, but I think I found the issue. So we've got an oil pressure sensor, and then that harness tees off down to the engine speed sensor or the crank sensor. The crank sensor will make it shut off if it loses signal, whereas the cam sensor it won't. So got a bit of an issue down right here. The loom's bare and I can see wires sticking out, so I'm thinking, or I'm hoping, the crank wire's rubbing on that sensor. So as you can see, it's not a fun spot. So I'm going to undo the pressure sensor here, and then from underneath, there's the crank sensor, so we should be able to pop that off without taking the oil filter housing out, get the wiring out, and I want to check and see what the wires look like. So for the life of me, I couldn't get the connector off, and if you look at this new sensor, there's not really much support out here, so I was afraid I was going to break this, and I was going to have to do this no matter what. So I left the connector plugged in. I'm not going to do this because the wiring, we got two wires right there. That yellow with purple tracer wore right down to the bare wire, and the other one is just starting to. So we're gonna cut those. Get shrink wrap on them, and obviously put them back together. So as far as what to use to repair that, a lot of times I use these pre-sealed butt connectors, and you just run a torch over them and shrink them down. But as you can see, the 1824, so I've only got one of them. So the other option is going to be some uninsulated one and some good dual wall adhesive line shrink tube. So grab some of that, and we'll fix her up. I got all that tidied up down in there. This wire wasn't me, but down in there I switched the wiring. Instead of being behind the pressure sensor and between the turbo oil pressure feed line, I put it to the front side. There's a lot more room between the sensor and this hose than there is backside, and there's less curves. So hopefully that should prevent it from rubbing again. And I know there was one spot in behind when I did my wife's car. The harness for the injectors and stuff were in a really bad spot. So there's a few common rub spots I'm starting to kind of see around this oil filter housing. So if you got an engine speed sensor or a crank sensor code, or it shuts off intermittently, that would be somewhere I would take a look to see if the looms wore off around here. It's not real fun to get at, but it's a lot better than doing the crank sensor. It's probably a good habit to get into before you put it all back together like this would be put BCDS on and make sure you don't have any codes, because it would kind of suck to put it all back together and then one of your crimps being bad or something like that and have a bad circuit, which would probably throw a code for. So I already put it all back together, but no faults found, so I am good to go.